Hey everyone, thanks for listening to another episode of Human Element. Today I'm speaking with Alex Cox, Director of Threat Intelligence at LastPass. Alex, thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So can you start off and tell us a little bit about your journey so far?
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the security space for over 20 years now, in IT for over 25 years. I had sort of a surreptitious route to get into security. I actually started my career as a police officer, and I was so a local cop for a few years. And that was back in the time before computers and police cars and stuff. So there wasn't a whole lot of cyber or IT work as far as that goes. But I got to the point where I was like, maybe I don't want to do this as a career. And I had been a computer hobbyist, so ended up working at a help desk at Wachovia, and that sort of grew into, doing some specific desktop architecture stuff, which kind of grew into malware analysis, which eventually grew into threat intelligence before threat intelligence was really a thing. I kind of jumped from company to company size wise. So, went from big bank to a small startup called NetWitness. Was at NetWitness for a while. NetWitness was purchased by RSA. So I did the RSA thing for a while. RSA EMC was purchased by Dell. So I went to the big tech firm. And then I basically said, okay, I want to go back to banking. And I was the threat intel director or executive at Bank of America for a few years. And then Hoff, who's a friend of mine, basically said, hey, I need a threat intel guy over at LastPass. Would you like to come help? And I said, sure. So that's where I ended up. And that's what I've been doing for the past 2 years.
Awesome. Can you tell us about any major life events that have shaped how you lead your teams?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, so the Wachovia thing was kind of interesting, right? So we got to the point where I was doing malware analysis, but we wanted to start doing more network focused analysis from a security standpoint. And again, that was back in the day before network forensics.
I was going to say a lot of these didn't have job titles at that point.
Yeah, it was before it was a thing, right? So I can remember us doing multiple megabyte captures on the edge routers and just seeing if we could catch something, right? And that sort of turned into this, larger scale deployment of, NetWitness and a big, network forensic capability. But that particular job was the job where it sort of made me focus on thinking sort of outside the security box. And it's like the time I said, okay, I feel like I'm really a security professional now because I'm thinking sort of like a hacker and outside of the typical box that you learn in your training and schooling. And being able to have a team that you can sort of rely on for that sort of thinking became really important at that point to go, okay, I need some really smart people that think the same. So as I've kind of progressed in my career, I sort of looked at it that way. Like, let me hire these smart people that can think outside the box because it sort of makes a better analyst. The other thing that I found out really important from that role is how important somebody like I really like hiring people that have a background in IT fairly deeply, because what they typically know is when you know how something looks when it's working right, it's easier to pick out when it's not working right. And I find that skill set sort of translates really well when you get into a security job because you're like, okay, this thing is not acting normal. What in the world's going on? And that curiosity is there. So I think that was like the big one early in my career. A little bit later, I had a situation where we discovered at NetWitness discovered a big malware package that we named the Niebuhr botnet. It was like back in 2016, some time ago. And that was like, here's the power of, talking in public about something that's really interesting from a security standpoint and the sort of interest and questions and following that can generate. So like taking the thread intel piece from doing these investigations, like as part of an incident response scenario or helping somebody out, from an investigation scenario to let me talk about this from a thought leadership perspective and how important that is, especially when you're trying to communicate that a company is, knows what they're doing from a security standpoint, building that sort of team that has that sort of capability. So, like when I look at building a team today, I want those soft skills and that ability to write and communicate and be vocal about the things that you think are important, but also the technical background to be able to kind of figure out where where those things that aren't working correctly and need some more investigation are. So those are probably the two main ones that really sort of guided how I built teams today.
Cool. What non-technical skill has helped you the most in your career?
Writing, absolutely. I mean, the ability to write in a way that is, simple yet technical enough to communicate the things that you're trying to communicate from a threat standpoint, super important. And it's one of those skills where not a lot of people have both the technical side and the soft side, and being able to kind of combine those seamlessly is really valuable. And one of the really interesting things that I've found more recently is the past 3 years or so, I've been pretty deep in the AI LLM space. And what I've discovered is that people in threat intel that communicate a threat event, in a way that's easy to digest, that approach really is very similar to the, prompting well, right? Because I say, like, from a threat standpoint, I might say, here's the situation, here are the concerns that we have, and here are the things that we need to figure out. If I go to prompt an LLM for anything else, I'm basically doing the same thing, right? Here's the situation, here's the things I'm interested in, and here are the questions I want answered, right? And that's the basis of a good prompt too. So, that translation of those threat intel analysis and writing skills to this current technology that the world is dealing with has been a really interesting sort of diversion.
Ah, it's an interesting alignment there. It makes sense. But can you tell me about a mistake that led to significant personal growth?
I think part of that is around recognizing when you're underwater, right? When something is over your head, either technically or, process wise, or just political, right? There are situations that I've approached in my career where I've been like, okay, I know how this works. This is how we should do it. And here are the people we should involve. And then when I look a little bit deeper, I'm go, okay, I missed a bunch of stuff, right? I missed some of the stuff between those things, right? The processes are a little bit deeper. The people that may not have a leadership perspective, but are leading, in a individual contributor standpoint. So making sure that I recognize those sorts of those approaches has been really important. I try to be very specific in the way that I analyze things, keeping that in mind because I know I've made those mistakes in the past. And I've, my ability to understand the relationships between people and the process and the requirements, I think, are a lot better based on those early experiences of not understanding the picture and pretending like I knew what was going on. So,
That sounds about right. Is there any one individual who had a major impact on your trajectory?
so two people really I could name there. So Amit Yoran, probably know that name well. A really good friend. One of my mentors at that witness. He Amit really taught I'll say me, but I'll say us, like how to approach a job with this idea of fun in mind too, right? So he had this, I don't know if you've ever met Amit or had talked to him before he passed, but Amit was very focused on, we have this job to do, but don't let it kill you, right? Make sure you're having fun while you're doing it. And it was an approach that I've taken like kind of on in my career where I'm like, hey, this job sucks sometimes, right? We're doing IR, we're up all night, but hey, let's still joke around, have a good time, make sure that this experience is something that helps you grow as a person and not just stresses you out. And I think Amit had a really good way of communicating that and pushing that to its folks. So the NetWitness experience with Amit was pretty amazing. The second person I'll name is Chris Hoff. Like, I don't know if you know Hoff either, but Hoff is a brilliant technologist. He's done it all. Like he's one of the one people I know that I can ask a question either technically or otherwise, and he will give me the straight answer with not a whole lot of BS, right? Here's what you need to do, or the things that I've run into. And again, that approach has been really important in my career too, because there's always that balance between, do I need to respond to this person in a softer manner, or do I need to be more technical? And Hoff has been amazing at sort of balancing that line with me. And it's again something that I've taken in my own career where I can deal with other people and say, this person needs this particular approach, and this is how you get the job done with this particular person. So being able to judge the way you respond to people is something that Hoff has passed on to me. So yeah, Amit and Hoff, both amazing humans and have been huge influences for me.
Tell us about the most valuable lesson you've learned from a security event or operational failure.
So I have been involved in a number of fairly large incidents, and you probably just look at news and figure out what I'm talking about. And those I've always been sort of a run towards gunfire kind of guy. Like, was in the military, was a cop. Had done threat intelligence and response all the time, and understanding that it's not the end of the world, right? Put your head down, don't stress out, get the job done. That's sort of like that has happened sort of over and over again. And a funny story about the LastPass security event. I got the job. Hoff, the day one, Hoff was like, okay, do all your onboarding and training and stuff. Day two, he said, y'all onboarded and good. Come help us with this incident. So it was like, right from the frying pan into the fire. And, the team is so amazing at LastPass from a security standpoint, a security expertise standpoint, that working with those guys on these big events has been really a pleasure. It's one of those things where it's a high stakes game that you're playing, but again, having that team that's really strong and being able to deal with that is one of those things that has been really valuable. So I think just dealing with large incidents in general has just helped me be a better manager and a better security professional, just, career wise in general.
How do you prepare new members of your team for that kind of environment?
So part of it is the people that I hire. I tend to look for people that I really like hiring veterans. I really like hiring, ex-law enforcement folks, largely for that reason, right? They're just very accomplished and understand the dealing with stress and kind of pushing through some of those stressful events and being able to get the job done. But I also look for people that have corporate experience, right? Because you don't face similar stress, but there is related stress there, right? You typically have a lot more politics to deal with. You have a lot more levels of leadership to deal with. And, being able to look at somebody that has that background is important. So, I think what's really cool about threat intel is you don't have to hire the super technical guy that has a computer science degree, right? It's you can hire people from all over the place. I have, one of my employees was a career intelligence analyst, very high level in the government, from a military standpoint. And he has that very measured approach to how to get things done. He's got a lot of experience in those stressful, high stakes environments. And then one of my other employees, came out of a master's degree program at one of the universities in DC. And, she is like an amazing communicator and, is able to jump into things and figure things out. And, two very different people, but, very complementary. So, being able to kind of hire that sort of person and, understand that they've got some of that high stakes background and they've got some of that stress management capability already, I think kind of puts them into the space. The other thing I'll say is that people in threat intelligence tend to be like folks in incident response and, red team and stuff. And they understand that stress is part of the job, right? I'm going to go into this job. I'm on call 24/7 for the most part. If something happens, they're going to expect me to give my perspective and help solve the problem. So, just making sure that one, the person has the background that will let them deal with that. And two, the person has an understanding that that's what they're stepping into, right? So, hey, be very aware that this job is not going to be your 9 to 5, just do your work and go home at night. You might get called at 2 in the morning sometimes to handle this problem. So I think that's really important. Now, and that's not to say too, that you can't take somebody that's brand new, doesn't have that background and sort of roll them into that. Cause we've done that too. And, again, it takes a special person. And sometimes you might do a point where you're like, this person is just not built to handle this. Let's find something else that they can do that, that they're built to handle. And that happens. But yeah, again, having that background and I think, the ability to communicate when stressed is probably the key piece.
What is the most rewarding aspect of your job?
It's kind of cliche, but the team, like that's what keeps me coming back is, one of the things that I found is the camaraderie and stuff that you develop in the military and law enforcement based on the situations that you're involved with is really hard to recreate in the civilian world. And there's really only two places that I've seen it, and they're kind of weirdly related. But one is the security space, right? Because cyber is very stressful in some cases. You're involved in these high stakes, incidents, and you have to kind of deal with that. The other place is in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. So I do Brazilian Jiu Jitsu as a hobby, and the relationships that you build doing BJJ are very similar. It's odd, but they're very similar, right? There's a closeness involved in that particular martial art. So those two things I think are for me is like the camaraderie you develop in the military and that we see in cybersecurity, and then also kind of, tangentially related to jujitsu. So the relationships are the best.
How has your approach to building trust with your team evolved?
So that lesson goes back a long way. I was an Army officer for about a decade before I got into the IT world. And when you're an Army officer, one of the things that you learn about and the way you approach planning missions is this idea of commander's intent. And commander's intent is not, this is how you should do the job. It's, this is what we want to accomplish. Use your smart guys to figure it out. And, from a management lesson standpoint, sometimes I think it takes people that don't have a military background or haven't been exposed to that sort of situation. It takes them a while to figure that out, right? And you hear about the micromanager and like, okay, we need to do this. You're going to do A, B, C, D, E, F, G in this order. Exactly. And, my management approach is completely the opposite based on that experience. I go, hey guys, we need to report on this particular threat actor for this particular audience. Go do it. And let me see what you produce. What I found is that builds trust because the employee or the analyst understands that like you're giving them that runway, right? You're letting them perform, letting them do their thing, and they know that you trust them to do a good job, right? So being able to let your folks run and give them that runway to be successful, I think is really, really important. Well, that's probably the main one.
You're also giving them license to surprise you with things you didn't know you needed.
Oh, absolutely, yeah, and, that's another favorite part of the job is to have a task and have one of my folks come back and go, "Hey, look at this," and I'm like, "Man, I never thought of it that way," or, "That's a really unique approach," and, showing it off to some of the other managers, seeing if you can apply the approaches in different places, that's a really fun part of managing a security team kind of in general because like I said, it tends to produce people that think outside the box.
Yeah, when you're up against people who are thinking outside the box, that's kind of important to have.
Yeah, exactly, right?
The threat intel is definitely an area where the state of the art and the understanding of what's going on evolves pretty rapidly. And, there's also a lot of technical skill understanding required. How do you balance kind of those two needs?
It's one of those, like, try to learn something new every day situations, that the approach to, I think, cybersecurity in general requires somebody that considers themselves and practices being a lifetime learner. Because, I've jokingly said to people before is, threat intelligence is the art of tell me as much as you know about something you just heard about as quickly as possible, right? So, my ability to jump into a subject and go, all right, I don't really know a whole lot about, web development. What are the basics I need to understand? Where are the places the attackers are going after? Who are the attackers that are interested in this sort of info and sort of building out that understanding in that way. It's an approach I think that has served me well for a while now. And, understanding that like, hey, you know what? If I need to work with this AI stuff, I need to figure out how this AI stuff kind of works in the background. So, doing that research and watching YouTube and, trying things out and, being an experiential learner, I think is super important too. But yeah, it's one of those things that you have to learn something new every day. You have to kind of keep up with it. And, if you can't, you have to rely on your team to help out. So it's like being a lifetime learner is kind of the basic.
How do you define success for your team?
Success for my team. That's a good question. I would say stakeholder support, right? For a threat intel team, you're essentially a information and data source for multiple teams. One of the things that I like about it is, I might be briefing the CEO on something one day, and then I might be working with the development team the other, from just two entirely different levels of information. And, kind of being able to kind of pivot between that is a really interesting part of the job. Again, it's something that I think people have to understand about doing threat intelligence work, that's another sort of key part is being able to quickly, one, pivot on a particular subject matter that you need to learn about, but two, pivot the way you communicate depending on the audience. And again, I keep going back to the AI thing because like I said, I've been really deep in that recently. And it's a very similar approach. Like what level of information do I need to get here? What level of query or questioning do I need to do? What's the audience that I'm going to use this data for? It's all sort of related, but like, yeah, understanding your audience and then being able to pivot sort of technically between the more technical and the less technical from a subject matter standpoint.
Is there any daily routine you found especially helpful?
For threat intel, keeping track of news events obviously is huge. So, one of the things that I do almost every morning is what I call a news scrub. Like, hey, what's going on in the world? What do we need to think about? And when you get a little deeper into threat intel, one of the things that you'll start to predict is like, oh, here's this like geopolitical event that's occurring that's not directly related to cyber, but we might see some like kind of second order cyber effects. The great example that I use all the time is, if you look at the Russian Ukraine conflict, it's sort of a proving ground for what the bad guys might do in a kinetic conflict from a cyber perspective, right? So we're like watching them, watching the Russians take down power grids and, use drones and, all of this sort of cutting edge warfare technology and, going, how will that apply to us, in the future? How could it apply to a kinetic conflict that we were involved with? Or if, the threat actors are using that particular technique and testing it out because it's clearly not working all the time, but it is occasionally, where was that going to go in the future, and how are we going to see it in the in the general threat environment? So that's one of the things that I think is pretty important, is sort of just kind of keeping an eye on the news events and the things that occur. And what's really funny is I've been a threat intel pro for 20 years, and I watch the news and I'm like, I totally missed that. For whatever my news sources that, I've been watching, I missed that. And I, go dig into it and go, okay, I'm glad I watched CNN this morning because that gave me some info that I didn't have before. So yeah, being kind of aware of the news cycle and, the things that are happening in the world, both from a geopolitical and a cyber standpoint, are kind of, a key part of my daily routine.
So if you find yourself overwhelmed, out of focus, how do you get back on track?
I'm, a big supporter of stepping away, for a bit if you can, kind of clearing your head, going for a walk, kind of figuring that out. Physical activity, physical fitness is a big part of that. But again, from a more corporate sense, like leaning on your team, being able to go, hey guys, I can't deal with this right now. I've got too many things going on. Can you help me out here? And that's not, maybe not just internally on the threat and tell team, but, with other teams too, because we've got a number of directors at LastPass that all do security work, and being able to go to those guys and say, "Hey, challenging environment for me right now. Can you give me a hand here?" And that trust thing that we talked about is really important there, because if you use that particular capability with your teammates in a way that makes sense, it builds that trust, because they go, man, Alex is normally not stressed out. If he's coming to me and he's stressed out about something, he really needs some help. So let me drop some stuff and help him out. So I try to approach those relationships in that way too. It's like, hey, lean on your game, and make sure that they trust you enough to be able to understand when you're underwater and you need some help.
Nice. Is there something you do as a leader that you'd like to see other leaders do more often?
One of the things that I found is that, and this isn't 100% rule, but as you get higher in the food chain, the way you communicate tends to get a little bit more abbreviated, and largely that's because of the time constraints, right? I've got 37 meetings today, and I have 5 minutes to talk to Alex about something. Here's something very abbreviated. I think in the way that we communicate these days, like with text and Slack and Discord and all of those kind of chat rooms and text messages, all that jazz, it's very easy to be misunderstood, from a tone standpoint or a desire standpoint. And I think that making sure that you think about that mechanism of communication and soften some of those messages is something that a lot of people could use, right? And it could be something as simple as like using an emoji. A lot of people hate emojis, but a lot of times using an emoji will help you communicate your tone, right? I'm not mad. This is a joke, or, hey, this is serious. I need a little bit more help. But just, being able to communicate that tone in the way that we communicate nowadays, because you can't always talk to somebody on the phone or can't always video call somebody.
So what does an effective team culture mean to you, and how do you know when you have one?
So I think the main thing is that your team is able to voice complaints or things they don't agree with, and not feel like that they'll be retaliated against. Because I've been in some jobs where if you spoke your mind and it wasn't sort of the company line, it was, not good, and you would get, penalized for it. So, as long as my team is safe in saying, hey, Alex, I know we put this process into place, but this particular step is not working and we need to figure it out. Or, I'm overwhelmed right now. I can't work on that. Can you give me a day or two? Like that sort of approach. Like I want somebody that's comfortable enough to voice that sort of opinion, like that sort of, hey, I need help, or, hey, I don't agree with this. Cause I think, back to the trust thing, it shows that they trust you. They trust that you're not going to, hold it against them. And what this job is all about ultimately is not the techniques, or it's not the technical piece of the technology, it's the people, right? And, we've got to be able to have those uncomfortable conversations in some cases to really solve the problem. So I think that's a really important part. It's just that freedom to communicate in a way that communicates what you need.
What is your approach to difficult decisions?
I'm one of those sort of deep analysis guys, so I do a lot of, here's this problem. How have other companies solved it? Hey, here's somebody I trust. Hey, man, how have you solved this problem? How have you approached this problem? I can definitely say that I can also get into sort of the analysis paralysis situation too, where you're like, I've got all this data and I don't have a straight answer, and I can't figure this out. Again, it's the people thing, being able to lean on folks that, have, some experience in that space or have dealt with a similar situation, being able to bounce it off of people. So, a lot of times what you'll see me do at work is go, okay, I have an idea how to handle this. I think I understand how it works A to Z. Let me go to this other guy and say, hey, this is my plan. What do you think? And, and that could be from any level. A lot of people will get really hung up on, I can't really ask my guys how to do this because that might show them that I don't know what I'm doing. And, that hurts my ego. And I think being honest with yourself and being able to go, hey, this is something that's out of my league. I just don't understand it. And you'll see me do that at work, a lot. Like I might ask the CTO one day, how are we doing this? Because I don't understand this, knowing that he'll go, yeah, man, this is how you do it. This is how this works. This is who you need to talk to. So again, that communication piece and figuring out where you can lean on folks and lean on your peers, as well as doing the research, doing your due diligence to figure out what the other answers to the problem have been from other perspectives.
What is your go-to advice for new people in the field?
Learn as much as you can. If there, one of the things that I found really interesting in 2025 from a general sense is just the access to information that people have. When I started 20 years ago, it was like, there was really no book for it, right? It was like, figure it out. Like, how do you do malware analysis?
Find the source code and
Yeah. I don't know. Let me execute this malware on this machine and see what it does, right? That was it. Right now you can go take a SANS class and, get a very structured A to Z approach on how to do that analysis. So for people that come in new, like if your company offers training resources, take advantage of them as often as you can. I've had jobs that, would send you to a SANS course every year, so I had like 12 SANS courses, that I went to. Again, so a lot of people now with some of the training capability that we have, they'll go, you have a membership to this training site, go use it for whatever you want. And, being able to, I guess, again, constantly learn and figure things out. The other thing I say is not to be afraid to try things. A lot of people, I look at like my dad, I'll give you a great example. A lot of folks from his generation, he's like, well, I don't want to do that on my computer because I might break something, right? I don't understand this. I don't want to break it. And, I think in security, like break it, go try something and break it because that's sort of part of the job. It's like figuring out how to leverage this technology in a way that it wasn't intended for and seeing what you can do with it. So, you know, get a computer and do malware analysis if that's your thing. Pull up one of these AI tools and do some vibe coding and try to figure stuff out. Talk to folks that are in the field and figure out how they approach things and, see if you can use some of the same, techniques. So, building those relationships, taking advantage of those, training opportunities and being curious as far as exploring your job function to kind of figure it out. The advantage that that gives you too is eventually you may come across something where you go, this is really, really interesting to me. And I want to pivot my career and start doing this instead. So it's that opportunity to not only get better at your current job, but maybe discover an interest area that you might not have had in the past and kind of figure out where you want to go. And I think one of the biggest things that I communicate to my folks is you drive your own career, right? You can't just sit and expect people to go, Alex is really good. We're going to promote Alex. They may think that, but you have to kind of drive it too. Hey, this is what I want to do. I was doing this training and, I came across this new thing and I really want to be, really want to do this new thing. So how do I get to that new thing? And, sort of understanding that being curious and asking those questions and, driving your career towards the things you want to do, super important. So
what is your approach to mentoring?
I am I'd say kind of a informal mentor. I'm sort of like I know a lot of managers and executives will have a very structured approach to mentorship, right? We're going to meet 6 times a week, or we're going to we're going to do these things. You have the project to do, blah blah blah. Whereas I'm much more like, hey, let's talk and just kind of understand who we are from people standpoint. Figure out our interests. Where do you need some help? What are the things I can help you with? I'm a big believer in sort of spot feedback, and that, again, that comes from I think my military experience too, where if you see somebody do something that you think they could have handled in a better way, just kind of pulling them aside and saying, hey, you did it this way and it worked, but this might make it easier next time. This may help you with your approach. The same, both from a technical standpoint, also from a social or political standpoint, like, hey, that guy is the boss, but this dude number two is the guy that makes a lot of the decisions. So go make friends with him first, and then you'll have a better option with the big boss. So understanding that the job is not necessarily just technical and process. There's also some people stuff there. Again, I keep going back to the people think it's such an important piece. but like understanding the politics play a part too. And it took me a while to figure that out, in my own career. So it's something I try to communicate, like, make sure you understand the politics because that's a big part of getting things done.
Absolutely. Are there any books, podcasts, resources that you tend to recommend to people?
One of the things that I'll push LastPass a little bit here. We have our own podcast. It's called The Fishbowl. It's threat intelligence related. So if you kind of want to get an approach to the way LastPass does threat intel, it's a great option to the folks on my team, and they're just funny and amazing. So that's the product push on my side. From a general sense, I'm pretty wide ranging when it comes to podcasts, and I tend to focus on more the people talking about the subjects I'm interested in than any one particular podcast. So for example, again, going back to the AI thing, because I've been doing a lot of work there, watching Stanford lectures on AI has been really pretty neat. Looking at some of the foundation models and the foundation teams that are kind of on the cutting edge, understanding where things are going and how they're approaching things. Really interesting. I've watched some really, basic like podcasts that are like interviews with folks like, hey, we're just gonna, similar to this one, we're just gonna talk to this guy about his career and what he's done. And might it be a security related, maybe it's military, maybe it's law enforcement, maybe it's technology, maybe it's jujitsu, right? It's kind of all those things. And what I found is that, having sort of a wide approach to the way you consume social media stuff can again sort of give you that bigger picture view. But yeah, like university lectures, technology leaders in the technology area. Like I said, I can't really name any one particular one, but that's how I tend to focus on social media in general.
When you're talking to folks who are new to the space, how do you recommend they get started?
That is a great question because I've been asked that question so many times from people, especially cyber has sort of gotten a bigger coverage from the news. One anecdotal story, I remember President Obama mentioning cyber in one of his State of the Union addresses, and I was like, we've made it. The president mentioned cyber, right? It's a big deal now. So it was kind of a funny career thing. But, I usually tell people there's like one of three routes into cyber. One is, you have that background, like I mentioned, my employees, from a military or government standpoint, where it's sort of just sort of natural progression, right? Previously, there wasn't a whole lot of specific cyber stuff in the military, but people like military police and, intelligence analysts and those sort of tangential jobs that they could bring in. That's one approach. The second approach is just being a hacker, right? I know a ton of people in this field that have no formal education, no military law enforcement background. They've just figured stuff out, right? They've been like, I'm gonna figure out how to develop stuff. I'm gonna build tools, and then I'm gonna figure out how to break those tools. And then, oh look, I just found a 0 day. I'm gonna publish it. And that 0 day turns into, oh hey, Alex found a 0 day. Let's go talk to him about this related technology and see what he thinks. And that sort of builds and builds and builds. And the next thing you know, they have a security job, right? And that is at this point in at 2025, right? That has exploded to the point where you have people that never get a formal job in security, but they're making a living doing like bug bounties and pen testing and that sort of thing. So that's probably one of the tougher ways to get into it, but that builds really, really good security folks because they had to sort of do it themselves and figure it out themselves. And then the third population I'd say is the formal education, right? There are lots of degree programs in cybersecurity, both from an undergraduate and graduate, situation. There are lots of training facilities that do very specific cyber related training. I've always been a big fan of SANS, so that's a great example. And so leveraging that sort of formal education approach, which has gotten way easier these days than it was previously, and being able to kind of build into that. The fourth, it was not a population, but sort of approach that I think people miss, especially early on, is the networking piece, right? If you know people that are in the field already, have some decision making or hiring capability, right? Go make friends with those people. Make sure they understand the type of person you are, the skills you have, because when that job comes up and they look at it and they go, I know a perfect person for this, right? I talked to this guy the other day and he's exactly doing this on his own and he's done all his own education. Let's go talk to him and pull it in. And I've hired a number of people that way that have just reached out to me and said, hey, I'm trying to get into cyber. Here's what I've been doing. What do you think? And I go, I don't have any recs right now, but let me think about it later. Something will open up and I'll go, hey, remember you talked to me? Let's talk more. And, that's resulted in some great hires occasionally. So yeah, so the, previous background that's related, self-study kind of hacker approach or formal education are typically my three pools of new people.
On the way up the ladder, what would you say the hardest transition you had to make was.
The IC, the individual contributor to manager jump is pretty significant, because you go from having to sort of manage your own time and your own approach with typically a lot of direction to figuring it out on your own and being the guy that figures out the direction, right? And a lot, so that transition was somewhat challenging. I've always been sort of a technical manager because I like getting my hands dirty and doing the work too, as opposed to just directing and giving people direction and helping them understand the job. So I think that jump is pretty significant. In a lot of cases, well, won't say a lot of cases. In some cases, it just doesn't work, right? Somebody says, "I want to be a manager." They become a manager, and they're like, "This sucks. I want to do the job, right? I don't like dealing with people. I don't want to do the reviews. I don't want to, do strategy stuff. I want to like code." And that's totally okay, right? I'm a big believer in if this dude is interested or this, woman is interested in approaching their career a certain way and they want to make a jump into a management role, they make the jump, they do it for a year, they struggle a little bit and they go, I don't, I want somebody to come to me and go, this isn't for me. I thought it was, it isn't for me. Cause I'm like, you're a great employee, you're a good person. Let's find you a job that fits rather than go, okay, well, we're going to find somebody else to take a hike, right? I don't like approaching employees like that. I don't like approaching jobs like that. I'm very much a believer in hire a good person and find the right job for them. So yeah, that I see that to manager jump is sometimes challenging, and it was one of the more challenging approaches for me because again, it required you to sort of change your viewpoint from very focused on a specific task technically to looking at the bigger picture.
So AI is an obvious one here, but do you see any other trends developing in the space that are going to adjust how we lead our teams?
Yeah, I mean, so the AI thing is a huge one, and I know we talked about this at length already, but the AI thing is interesting because it has an approach both from a individual contributor standpoint, but also a manager standpoint. And the way I'm looking at it is when you're directing AI and doing AI agent stuff, it's almost like managing a team, right? So those management skills of figuring out the big picture, understanding strategy, looking at, structure and how you want to accomplish things directly relates to getting things done with AI. So you're starting to see sort of this merge of management skills and IC skills that I think we haven't seen in the industry before. So it's a really interesting place that I've like again been watching and paying attention to. The other thing is I think that as the cybersecurity field grows as a whole, we are starting to see a lot more specialization. So you see whereas historically we'd see a threat intel firm, for example, cover a bunch of different things. Like I'm going to look at nation states and cybercrime and insiders and hacktivists all at once. And as the field has grown, you start seeing people that are very specifically focused on certain areas. Yeah, so I'm like, are we going to start seeing that with some of the newer technology? Are we start seeing that with AI? Are we going to start seeing that with quantum computing and some of the sort of emerging tech? So I think paying attention to the way that the field sort of fractures in general is an important perspective to have because, you will eventually get to a point in your career where you need to make a decision on a technology or an approach. And if you understand the field that you're looking at and the way the vendor space is built out and some of the newer tech or the emerging tech, it makes that decision a little bit easier because you're able to go, okay, this would solve the problem now, but the way the industry is going, I might need to look at this. An example I'll give you is, if you're looking at, say, a DLP solution, right? One of the questions you're going to ask is, how is this DLP solution handling LLMs? Because people are just dumping all kinds of crazy stuff into LLMs and, you know, giving away the company secrets to these giant models. So I think having that perspective on how the industry fractures in some cases when it comes to capabilities will help you sort of understand where you need to line your ducks up as the technology progresses and sort of look ahead of what you need right now.
So when you're thinking about hiring for your team, what are the critical qualities you're looking for and how do you screen for them?
I'm very much like a feel interviewer, so I like to interview somebody and sort of just, does this person feel right? Do they interact well? Am I comfortable talking to them? Do they speak in a way that's personable? And, do I expect that they're going to interact? If they're going to interact with the way they're interacting with me now, they're probably going to interact in similar ways with other people. So, having that sort of personal approach to evaluating a potential employee, I think is pretty important. And again, what I typically do is just talk to the person, right? Just have a conversation. Tell me about what you're interested in. What's the last book you read? What do you do as a hobby? let me understand you outside of just your resume and the technical skills that you have. Well, that's one part, and then, the other part is kind of, is this person and this is kind of basic interviewing, right? Is this person blowing smoke or is he being honest, right? Is he being honest with his skills and his background, what he's done, and
AI answers.
right, right. And the again, going back to the personal relationship thing, understanding yourself as a manager and where your knowledge limits are, as well as knowing people that can help you there, I think is super important. So when I'm doing interviews or I'm evaluating a candidate, I might say, "Hey, I want you to talk to John too, because John does this job for, LastPass or the company I'm working for." And he'll give me some perspective on this person knows what they're doing, or, they are saying the right things, but the connections aren't quite right, or they'll have no idea what they're talking about and they're making shit up. So, again, having that approach, that personal approach, both how does this person interact in just sort of general sense, and then having the personal understanding of yourself to say, this is technically over my head. Let me bring an expert in to evaluate this and give me his perspective or her perspective. That's really important. So,
Awesome. So, unfortunately, Alex, that's all the time we've got for today. Before we wrap it up, if people want to follow along with your work, where's the best place for them to look?
I post occasionally on LinkedIn, so that's probably one of the easier ways to kind of follow what I'm doing. I do have an X account. It's perpetual sec. I don't do a lot on X in general, but I kind of surf and, lurk. So we kind of do things there. You know, other than that, and pretty easy, right? Find me on LinkedIn, send me a message. I'm more than willing to answer questions and interact. So happy to do it.
Awesome. Thanks for the amazing conversation, and have a great day.
Yeah, I appreciate it. We'll see you guys soon.